Today on the Perception in Action podcast, my interview with Craig Morris, Olympic Slalom Coach for British Canoeing. How can embracing the idea that you don't know all the answers make you a better coach? So it's time for a call to action. Hi, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Before we get to today's topic, I want to tell you about my new book, Learning to Optimize Movement: Harnessing the Power of the Athlete-Environment Relationship, available now on Amazon in paperback and ebook formats. This book is the follow-up to my best-selling skill acquisition book, How We Learn to Move. In it, I discuss how we can go beyond learning basic coordination to becoming an elite mover, evidence-based principles for learning and coaching optimal movement. Take your game from proficiency to mastery. Now on to the show. Okay, today it's my pleasure to be joined by Craig Morris, who's been on the podcast in the Journal Club capacity a few times, and it's nice to go be able to do a deeper dive with him here. So thanks for joining me, Craig.
Lovely to chat again, Rob. Thank you.
So can you tell us a little bit about your background to start out?
Sure, yeah. I was brought up in the West Midlands in the United Kingdom, one of the finest canal networks in the world, definitely supersede Venice or anywhere else I've heard of. Largely sort of dragged kicking and screaming into paddling as a 5-year sibling to my older brother. Just sort of lived quite a long way away from whitewater, but always had a great sense of adventure. My parents would ship us off into the caravan every 6-week holiday, and we'd go and adventure on the coast, in water, in mountains, everywhere in the UK. So I've always had this sense of kind of a pull from the natural environment, and I guess that led me to take up with paddling itself as I grew away from football or soccer, as it is in America, and led down a path towards my own canoeing journey, which basically fell into coaching quite a young age, around 23, and then I've taken up with coaching and feel really fortunate to have worked, I guess, from beginner level through to where I currently situated coaching Olympic athletes.
Yeah. No, and I know you've had a lot of success and had award from So yeah, I know, and I could my neighbor when I was a kid was actually into paddling, and we used to go camping trips, and we would do rapids, and he would do all the work in the back, and I would be scared to death in the front of the canoe, but it was super fun. So I definitely can appreciate the challenge and the skill involved in. Yeah, so what I wanted to have you on, to talk about is you have a article out with Carl Woods and Keith Davids, right? With a wonderful title on the wisdom of not knowing, reflections of an Olympic Canoe Slalom Coach. And so I want to kind of, as I said before we started recording, it fits perfectly with my theme. I want to kind of explore this year people's experiences, kind of, adopting a more ecological approach, and kind of what advice they have for other people and things like that. So to start off, can you tell us, it sounds like from the article and that you had a very traditional kind of approach to coaching, more when you started, kind of the prescriptive correction, looking for, the correct form kind of approach. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, my early years of coaching, I took up with it largely ignorant of any theory or conceptualization of what coaching is or what motor learning was. I think I'd always enjoyed the relational side of human to human, and always enjoyed being in nature. So coaching was something that I felt I could take up with. And my vision of what canoeing was, particularly with a slalom kind of hat on, was largely aesthetically led, biomechanically led. My brother still has murals on the wall of some of the greatest British paddlers who used to make it look effortless, this sense that they were time architects on the water. And that became my model, really. So when I started coaching, I was focused on two things: technique and relationships. And I remember my first coaching philosophy that I was largely coerced into to getting after was this triangle where, you know, you had technical on the bottom, you had relationships on the other side, and then this magical leap to performance at the top would happen somewhere in the triangle. And my coaching would, you know, miraculously make that come to pass. And I guess over time, Rob, I've just become, I mean, the more I've coached, the less I know.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, the more I thought of what I knew has been proven to be either incorrect or has been evolved significantly away from what I thought it once was. That it kind of, a few jolts along the way with people leaving the sport, maybe not having the experience that I thought I was creating in this environment, not being very individual about my coaching, because I was coaching through a model that was effectively disseminated onto others, not developed with others. And all of this I was largely ignorant to along the way, I think, and only subsequent years of reflection and taking up with different things, speaking with different people and coaching more, have I realized that embracing uncertainty is something that you can take up with, and that it's actually enthralling. It really kind of runs through your veins, because that letting go of ideas of certainty makes you more attentive. You attend on how people are taking up with the environment, and I think the big shift has been that I understood that the performance was the paddlers and not the coaches. So yeah, it wasn't that it was a model of coaching as such, because I didn't have one. I wasn't conscious of one. Subsequently, you could argue, yes, it was this methodology of coaching that I was taking up with, and whether that was from having experienced that passively. I wasn't coached myself much, which I'm thankful for. So I came in as a blank canvas. I just happened to have some peculiar paints that I was throwing at the canvas.
Yeah, and I think you discuss nicely in the paper. There's, you know, this question I always get when talking about like things like paddling, climbing also falls into this issue of previewing, the importance of previewing a course, right? Because like, as you say, you paddling, you have to go on a course you never get to practice on, right? You have to walk, and previewing seems on the surface to fit kind of this prescriptive plan. When you get here, we're going to do this. When you get this part of the river, we're going to do that. And I always find it a challenge to answer that, how that fits into a model. So can you talk a little bit about that? Is that perhaps why you were drawn to coming up more this technical focus by that kind of fit with paddling?
I think certainly I wouldn't be as bold to cast the web across anywhere outside the UK, but my experience within the UK is that the planning of the run is heavily linked to the execution. So the execution is almost post hoc related back to how close did you deliver the plan from the bank. Okay. So it's almost like you play out a movie in your head, and then the paddling bit is just kind of moving between the chapters on the Netflix controller, you know?
Right.
And if there's no skipping of the disc, as it was on DVDs in my day, then you've had a pretty good run. To the point where coaches will sit down, and I've probably been one of them, and say, right, if we're 95% achieving the plan, then we're happy, we can move on, and we're progressing. And I became, I guess, increasingly uncomfortable of that prescriptive element. Is that, well, what if the 5% is critical? You know, some things are critical, some things are not. But 5% can be extremely time critical in terms of a performance outcome in our sport. And I just didn't know who was in charge of attributing whether the plan was, you know, aligned to delivered or not. But it definitely does lead to that. I guess it's that general cultural, sociocultural grasp for want of control, want of certainty. And, you know, when we zoom out, and writing this paper was a beautiful reflective process for that. It's like, who are we to dominate a natural environment like a wild river? Okay, they're more artificial these days, but they're still extremely dynamic. Yeah. And that kind of removed perspective, that drone view of the sport that I began to take up with about 10 years ago, has given me a very different view of what the process of preparation, as we now call it, is versus planning.
Yeah. I know in the paper you have this very open, reflective moment where you talk about like an athlete worrying not about their actual performance, worrying that they didn't do what you told them was the right thing to do, right? They could have gone fast and around, but they were worried about they didn't do what you wanted them to do, which is, we all kind of face, I think, humble a moment like that.
No, yeah, that was a massive jolt. It's worth touching into. Massive jolt in my coaching journey, I think, and one that probably did trigger me to explore what coaching is, what motor learning is, and definitely led me towards an ecological kind of path that I lean into now. In that I became increasingly aware through verbal feedback from athletes, quite strong verbal feedback, and your body language too, that I was a source of information during their performance. So my secondary kind of coaching model or biomechanical model of excellence, as I saw it, was an in-the-moment source of information, an indirect source of information for their performance. And they were quite robotic in that. So if I get into specifics, I had a clear model of some keystrokes around a gate. And, if their hand was a little soft here, a little low, a little high, a little wide, a little flat, it was all about whether they'd aligned to how vertical that paddle was for me. And I'd become devoid of outcome. The task goal in itself, was it efficient? Was it effective on the watch? Because we don't get scored. We're not like gymnastics or diving. We don't get scored aesthetically. We get scored on time and penalties. And I became aware that I think one athlete pushed back to me and said, I knew you'd hate that. And that's what I touch on in the paper. And then after a little exchange, me kind of going, maybe I'm getting through. But and I was already thinking it. They went, it was effective, wasn't it? And that was a big jolt for me. It took a while to sink in. But that led me to a more task-oriented focus of skill, I guess, than a kind of predetermined, prescriptive, movement-focused approach.
Yeah. No, and I think, you do a nice, you mentioned a little bit, and you kind of start your paper with how, and then I think the subtitles, what if more we know, the less we see, right? The kind of, it aligns with kind of the indirect view of perception, right? That you need knowledge to interpret the world, right? I can't. And even I was thinking when I was reading your paper, it reminded me, my PhD supervisor Martin Regan had a very similar view, that kind of reading all the literature before you jumped into a topic was actually a hindrance, right? Because it makes this filter which with you see the world and you miss things, right? Can you talk a little bit about that? This kind of not seeing the world through all this knowledge of, in Gibson's terms, about we've gathered, and kind of moving away from, I guess, I think the word you use, certainty, kind of, that's part of why we want it too, right? It makes us feel more comfortable rather than, having the plan. So you can talk a little bit about that, kind of this the knowledge, the danger of too much knowledge, maybe.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah. I find it constrains attention too narrowly, I think. And we talked in the paper around, Andrew Gregg and from his mentor Norman McCaig in terms of witnessing birds and observing birds. And the beautiful line is there that, sometimes the more you know, the less you see, and what you encounter is your knowledge itself.
Yes.
You're encountering your own knowledge rather than the thing itself, the thing that's, emergent in the environment. And that was definitely what came to mind with the paddlers. They were encountering my knowledge, not even their own, secondary knowledge about, if you like, in terms of Gibsonian terms, rather than paying attention to the kind of key information that invites action in the environment. Because these are highly skilled paddlers that I'm fortunate enough to support and be around. And for me, constraining their adaptability and their degeneracy, or being able to keep multiple possibilities open as long as possible, which is critical in a dynamic sport where the water is always fluid and we're open to the wind, etc. I just felt a bit stupid, Rob, to be honest, that I would, being part of this suppressing of, and it was a drive for consistency. It was a drive to rule over nature, rule over the performer environment interaction. The fact that I believe we could control the river. We could stick it on a train track, if you like, and lock it in. If we, repetitively went over these techniques and they were really clear on the visual of it and the imagery of it, and it would act out in time. And what I realized was I was not only taking away their skill level, I was taking away their individuality. It's a bit like in the UK, people like Wayne Rooney was brought up as like a street soccer player, you know, and he was like, and you know, too much coaching at times. And I'm not saying that happened with Wayne, but I think you lose the individuality, their individual take up with the environment, their why ultimately. And I've had that, which has led to a lot of stuff that's written in the paper, was we removed people from why and we tried to make robots.
Yeah.
So I'm learning to let go of my own knowledge and try and meet what's actually occurring in the environment. And that includes people in that environment.
Yeah, I get that. You know, in the main sport I work in, baseball. Sometimes the expression sometimes we just coach the athleticism out of people. Like these people are athletic, like amazing. They could do all these. You know, you could probably invent a new sport for them where you have to hit one-handed standing on a rope, and they would come up with. But we kind of coach that out of them. We don't let them be that way. No, you got to be this way. Right?
That's right.
Yeah.
There's a couple of questions I like to ask, and I encourage maybe others to do so. They might find some interesting things there. So I didn't ask it until about 10 years into my career. What is your sport? Like, what is canoe slalom? Working backwards from the performance, you know, and you might factor that over a timeline of preparation for, delivery of, and reflection upon. But I would argue that's all in one time scale. But what is it, you know? And somebody once asked me, you know, what characterizes the best performers in the world at canoe slalom? Is it their ability to reproduce a plan developed before performance, or is it their ability to adapt within the performance? And the answer to me was pretty clear, and I felt pretty awful because I'd never considered it. And then I kind of realized that a lot of my practice and at the environment we were creating was effectively suppressing key characteristics of performance in the sport. So it was really like I'm perpetually sorry to everyone I've ever coached. Hopefully the ones ahead of me will have a better experience. But those sort of moments of really, I think we get locked into work building blocks or putting a jigsaw together on this picture that we pre-established, and building blocks of components of the sport rather than zooming out and just saying, what is the sport? What characterizes the very best or the very best performance for any individual? And another question that fascinates me and I've learned a lot from is, if you were to redesign the sport from scratch, what would it look like to give you the best chance of winning? Yeah. And that's a really nice personal question that is a good way of, people aren't very comfortable about talking about strengths sometimes, I think. And if you situate that in the relationship of the performance and ask them to redesign the sport, you kind of can start taking up with the invitations that they see are strong within them. Yeah.
If you could change the rules or the equipment or no, I think that's, you know, that's a great. I think when I talked to you a few episodes ago, I had Matt Wood on, and we were talking about, you know, constraining yourself as a coach, like trying to coach like the Paralympic version of your sport. How, you know, you look at the essentials of it, right? You do reviews of it. Yeah. No, I think that's really interesting. So, did you have, you know, it sounds like this kind of was a progression for you, not like a light bulb moment. Did you have, you know, did you feel like did you just dive right in, or did you just kind of make a subtle change, like not saying as much? Was there kind of a first way you dove into this?
Did it pretty badly to start with.
I'm sure lots of people because people struggle. They love the idea, but you know, it's not easy.
Probably started down the classic route, like, let's use more open questions. Which, the one thing I didn't do well, that the athletes gave me great feedback on, was I just shifted without communicating with them.
Okay.
You know, I was in my own little coaching bubble, so probably still in this like hierarchical position of doing to or dictating to, disseminating to, rather than, you know, leading out with. In the sense that I started asking questions that were open, and I got feedback that it felt patronizing because they still felt I knew the answer.
Okay.
I was just positioning them down the correct path of the maze until it was their idea, and then miraculously.
Making them feel like it was their idea. Yeah.
And I was still searching for verbalized understanding from them. That makes sense.
Right. Yeah.
So I was still seeking them to verbalize their knowledge to me, and because I felt that was important. And what I did in response to that feedback was hone in to really understand my why a little bit, why I was coaching the way I was coaching. That led me down a rabbit warren of research that I'm still very much in. And I communicated my why to them and shared it, not as here's how we're going to work moving forward. Here's what I'm currently thinking about coaching and what that means for our environment of practice. What do you make of it? I remember having 3 athletes in the room, and some little bit of challenge, some given their experience. And I said, how would you fit into this? What would your challenges be to this? And how does that align to your view of what the sport is from your perspective? Because I'm a big fan of coaches giving away the keys as guardians to pedagogy, and athletes taking up with a set themselves. Let's get some more keys cut for that room. So communicating my why was massive, even if I wasn't that sure of it. I think it was part of evolving it, and that was probably the first step to being more openly vulnerable.
Yeah, that's what. I wanted to ask you about that kind of I'm working with a few coaches that they're struggling with kind of confidence because embracing this uncertainty, complexity is just so different. It's giving up the power. It's giving up the kind of perception most people have that the coach has all the answers to how you should, and it's and it's also, I think people on the surface, a lot of it feels like playing around compared to the emphasis on more game, like more instead of these rigorous looking drills that seem more. So I think there's a lot of things that kind of can kid at a coach's confidence when you make this change.
So, yeah. So like playing around was phase 2, I think, after the questions. And the headline learning from this is know who you're working with, and know how they take up with the environment. So a wise sage who I connect with quite regularly, Richard Cheetham, over here, is a coach developer in the UK. He once said to me when discussing kind of the level of stretch in your practice design with athletes, he said, well, Craig, we go to a fancy dress. We might be quite comfortable in the most, obscure clothing. we might not be too embarrassed, but for a particular person like that might just be the same level of stretch might be changing the color of their socks. And the reason that was profound to me was that I was probably going to a level of chaos that was almost too far a stretch for certain people. And I wasn't individualizing the constraints, the environment, the type of games we were using. It was too much of a leap. And those people kind of saw it as all consuming, I used to call them chaos sessions. And a friend over here said, I've started using the word dynamic training because people think it's more strategic. But that was definitely a take home. And that was probably the start, Rob, of co-creating training environments, like actually going, okay, maybe it would start with me presenting a menu of potential options. And they would select 1 or 2. And that gave me an inkling of how they wanted to take up with the environment, where the stretch was comfortable or not. And then we'd co-design and co-adapt together as we went forwards. And sessions start to look very individual within one environment. That was really important. I think that sense of knowing the individual, and just like coaches, I think you've always got to be authentic to self. So if you are someone who is quite dictatorial and direct in your coaching, but you want to experiment in this space, try and take people with you, and try not to change fully to someone you're not, because people will think that's inauthentic and patronizing, and they might see straight through that. So it's a journey, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. I've had the same experience both with athletes and coaches, right? Some are willing to try almost anything I can think of. Other ones, the idea of throwing a ball that was 1 ounce heavier than the ball you regularly throw is sacrilege. Like, which is, and I don't blame them. It's not like a judgment, right? It's not a judgment on, saying that you should be open to anything, but I think this
is where the skill of coaching comes in, Rob. If we touch on representative learning design a little bit, so the concept of how much the training environment represents the information that the performers will face in the environment of competition, and scaling that, versus to ability and things like that. I think some people will, like you said, they'll do anything and they don't have to attribute it to whether it looks like the sport or why or not. They just love being on the water. They love playing around and stretching themselves. And then you've got other people who, like you say, that ounce difference in the ball, this has to equate to my performance. If I'm going to stretch here, I need to know what I'm getting back, because this is uncomfortable, making me anxious. I've not done this before. And I think the skill of coaching and knowing the people then is navigating that together, and really dwelling in it, and being like, apologizing became a regular thing for me, which it never was in the first 10 years of my coaching, and trying to lead out with them in that sense, which we touch on in the paper of, educare rather than educare, in terms of leading out together into the world, rather than coach as a hierarchical position of kind of teaching down or disseminating knowledge onto this kind of passive other. I think that was critical, definitely, in resituating I think becoming a learner again, fundamentally.
Yeah. No, I think so. And I think, just being the hard line of, has to be this way, especially when you go, I learned very quickly when I started being a consultant, that's not going to work, right? People will listen to you and nod your head but they won't adopt anything that you say. They'll go back. But if you can kind of
true.
You have to meet people where they are, is another phrase I often hear, but it's just,
people say to me, obviously delving into a bit of coach development and mentoring these days, and people often say to me, they're aware I lean into an ecological approach. And they say, what do you do when you meet people who don't? And I'm like, well, it's a good question. Firstly, I meet them where they're at. That's good coaching practice. And I'm not coming with this knowledge from an ecological perspective and trying to disseminate it on. I think where I start, which might be useful for some people, is the common ground of what is the sport? How do we both see, or more importantly, how do they see? And because I'm often going into sports that I don't have much knowledge about, which is beautiful in a way. And it's the same with athletes. It's not that athletes, although one of my athletes does cite attractor states and all sorts, Rob. He's a great student of your work as well. It's that sense of, can you find some agreement with what is the performance environment interaction in competition or during the game? And then what does that mean for training practices that are representative or not? And how do we scale that, and where are we spending our time? And that's kind of the mid zone that I try to dwell in, and then we see where it takes us. Yeah,
I find the same thing, and I try to have humility, and I try to always remind myself, and the coach. I work with extremely high level coaches. They must be doing a lot right if they got this job, right? You to rock up and say, "Oh, that's wrong." That's such a got to give yourself a shake if you think But I just getting people to think about it, changing, exploring, and varying things is kind of all. If that's 1 ounce of a ball, or that's doing a whole bunch of crazy things, that either one is fine for me to just kind of get. Let's try a little, I think that the principle I always start with, variability is, it's so many benefits, whatever you believe, and if we can get a little bit of that in there. So, I think that's a really good point, the kind of change in perspective you need, and the uncertainty, and so, getting a little back to the picture. So you kind of break, the kind of, the uncertainty into 3 different things, right? You start with the paying attention, and I love you have this phrase I want to get you to unpack: being prepared but not planned. I think that's a wonderful. Can you tell us what do you mean by that?
Sure. Well, firstly, it's not my phrase.
Oh, is it? Is it Carl?
Attribute that to an athlete, which I hope.
Oh, really?
In the paper. I did. Yeah. So we've been taken up together with the sport over. I'm fortunate enough to work with a couple of paddlers for a long time, and we were kind of challenging our own perspective of the purpose of the preparation, the purpose of the coursework, as we call it, the route planning, and what that meant for performance, and what it meant for the kind of this secondary information, and was that influencing attention during the run? Because effectively we were working with that particular athlete that we wanted to be more dynamic, more adaptable during the performance. So that phrase came from, I guess I see it as like a continuum. You know, you can be planned at one end. Let's say you're planned at one end, fully planned, prescriptive. I'm going to use this stroke. And this is what a lot of very good slalom paddlers used to do. They reckon they could visualize or use imagery to specify the number of strokes on a run and then deliver that stroke. The sport has changed a lot since then. And I'm not here to critique that particular approach, but very prescriptive, therefore perhaps tied to particular ways of doing things that, in my experience, leave people to be kind of quite frozen when those invitations to act are no longer available in the environment. It's all good if the sun's shining, the river's at this level, and the course is set like that. But the adaptability side of it, they just weren't able to access that because they were too kind of evaluative around this prescribed plan. So that would be one end of the continuum. The other end of the continuum would be to have no plan at all, right?
Just react.
To not even bother coming to look at the course, just point and shoot. And I'd be looking up at the number boards to see where you need to gather. Now, you would be naive to go there. So what we talked about is we kind of have like principles over rules, in that we have what you might call some sort of tactical kind of ways of doing things, or like, you know, my intention is to do this like this. And then we kept zooming out to top level. So it's more like, and what does that mean of where I place my attention? So you have intention and attention. So the intention might be the tactical decision to go forwards or do it as a reverse move. And where would the intention be to invite that or best invite that? And then we have options to stay open to adaptability in the run. And that became, this sense of being prepared but not planned. So probably sitting in the middle of that continuum, which I think is a beautiful kind of analogy for knowledge about and knowledge of as well. It's like knowledge about being secondary mediated information learned through words, through books, through images, through game models, through tactics. But the knowledge that's going to regulate behavior is knowledge of the environment. And therefore, we always kind of think, and part of writing this paper early on was that knowledge about is always submissive to knowledge of, because that's what regulates behavior. And I guess that prepared but not planned is kind of a tip of the cap in the direction of that, really. So we're staying open. I think in the paper we talked about it's like that balance of stretching toward things that you know in terms of information that's going to help specify action in the environment, but also waiting on information to present, to emerge, as it does in our environment all the time. So it's that balance, and prepared but not planned is trying to sit in the middle of that seesaw, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great, I think, you know, I always give these presentations about attention, how powerful it is. I think it's one of the most powerful resources we have, but it's also very dangerous, right? You know, confirmation bias, when we really focus on something, we miss purposely, right? That's what it's designed to, filter out all this other stuff so it doesn't distract you. Like the example I always give is at a party. Like if you're trying to have a conversation at a party and every voice was equally salient and loud in the whole room, you would be, your head would explode, right? You need to, but that's a very dangerous thing, right?
And I guess in that respect, the sense of I think this makes sense. I'll work it out and challenge me if not. But I think the sense of having a plan is almost like radical CLA. Radical constraints use, because you're funneling down your attention so narrow that, yes, if it works, if you're of a certain ability level that the paddlers are that I work with, lovely, game on. Reality of the interaction over time and my 20 odd years in the sport suggests that more times than not, you're going to need to be more dynamic and responsive.
Yeah. And I think, you know, the point I always try to make is like all coaching is constraints. Based coaching. That's all you can do as a coach. It's just whether are your constraints like this, right, where you have to do this stroke, or are your constraints like this, you know. The other thing like you said, I find myself doing this a lot too, coaching to principles. I think that's a really important, you know, why do you want them to have this paddle vertical, right? Well, what does that achieve, right? And I think thinking about those things really helps. It's like you were describing, like understanding what the sport is, like it kind of at a different level. But what's the function of this? And once you start doing that, you're like, okay, well, there's lots of ways that they can do that, but there are some key features of that. Yeah. So I like that a lot too. Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, kind of an aside, so you started with a very biomechanical model of what good paddling is. Do you still have any kind of, conceptions about what a good movement pattern is? You know what I mean? Like, do you try to push around their movement, or does it anything goes as long as it's effective? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
I can still admire some beautiful biomechanical precision. If I'm clipping a video, that's probably what's going on. But no, I mean, I've definitely moved towards task focused, and you're right. I do have to remind myself, well, was it effective? Always work back from a principle of, was it task goal focused? Was it effective? Was it fast? Was it clean? And not was it repeatable, but is it stable, which is another area we could explore. So we've moved from principles rather than rules. We've moved from stability rather than consistency, because consistency in our sport was definitely attributed to replication of a movement.
Okay. Yeah.
Rather than the stability of delivering an outcome. I think in that respect, I have to remind myself, but I really appreciate dynamic paddling now and the adaptability. And I find myself deliberately and just naturally affirming variability of movement now, responsivity, or as Carl phrases it in some of his work, being more response-able. Because I've learned that is an absolute key skill in our sport, to be able to sustain stable performance over time across different venues, different rivers, different water levels, and different categories. I coach one athlete who does 3 categories in the space of a couple of days. So there's a lot of different ways of taking up with the sport, and remaining open to them is critical. And the first step of that, you make me laugh now, like my messy desktop behind me was, I started by having an adaptability folder where I would clip out some videos that kind of reminded me, right, look, this is, we need to move into this space here, that it's not about a prescribed movement. It's about effective responsivity to the emergent opportunities for action in the environment. Much less than I was, much less than I was. I do find that when athletes share a photo with me, they still go, "Oh, look at my top hand there," and I'm like, "Oh no, it's still a legacy of the former Craig."
Yeah, no, it's totally. Yeah, no, I think that's a great that folder. I think I've said before. I spent a whole bunch of my career looking for what really elite athletes do the same, and when I kind of turned that to what they do different, it really just changed. Looking for different ways they could achieve the same thing. Just kind of.
And I don't know about you, Rob, but like that. Their reaction and their response when you suddenly start affirming adaptable movement to solve a solution. So then in a previous version of our interactions, coach athlete, it might have been like, they're probably going, "Oh, I'm offline." Classic canoe slalom phrase. "I'm offline. Damn, I'm low." And you're just evaluating against this predetermined plan. Whereas, when you suddenly start paying attention to how they take up with what's in front of them, so that it's almost the responsivity to where they are rather than the evaluation of where they are. Like, it's like, I'm here, what's possible, rather than I'm here, this isn't where I'm meant to be. Now what do I do about this? Oh, well, I'm low, it's gone, the race is over, blah, blah. Just affirming that, you start to see people go, oh, it's okay to make mistakes. And then we can get into what is a mistake or not, right? That's a whole podcast.
Yeah.
But yeah, you just start, they basically got permission to be at one on the water and not a line or subscribe to a version of a plan that you've either co-created or they've delivered solo or it's come from the coach. And you start seeing them be curious about how to solve problems when it's challenging.
Yeah. And accepting this. And no, I think it is. I've had the same kind of experience changing people's, in my sport, like a bad swing when you started off time, like way off time, and you could have just let it go and completely missed it, but you made an adjustment using a really awkward looking movement, but it worked. You hit the ball, right? It's expecting you to be perfect all the way. instead of, celebrating adjustments. And that really is kind of,
You'll laugh at this, Rob. I was it's my daughter's birthday yesterday, and we bought her a Nintendo Switch, and she pulled up the sports game with volleyball last night.
Oh, okay.
And we're playing away, and the game gives coaching feedback. So I'm doing the set, or the spike, and it's going a little too early, and mid pops up in a little annotation on the game, and then we spike and we win the point, and I'm like, well, was it too early?
Yeah.
What game model are we playing to here? I want the point, man. Come on. It's like,
that's funny.
We can never sleep as coaches, can we?
So, no. Maybe you gave the perfect set for because you were too early. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, no, it's funny. It's funny. So I think that's and I love you're kind of like reaching out, like this kind of you have lots of different ways of I know Carl does too, of the relationship with your environment, not imposing control over it, right? Connecting with it. I think that's a really important. Like I could see in a lot of ways you're saying, just walking and the river, the side, the bank, and connecting with what the athletes were doing and what happened, was instead of looking for things you wanted to see. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I did a bit of work with a guy called Stephen Rolnick who does some work in the field of motivational interviewing, and he uses the word moving beyond the deficit detective, and having your strength lenses on, as glasses. And that was really a description of my previous coaching that I wanted to let go of. It's definitely a deficit detective. It was like, if they delivered an effective solution, but it wasn't congruent with my model of biomechanics, I'd just pull it away from them. I was the but coach. I was like, but you wouldn't be able to do that 9 times out of 10. The answer they should have given me was like, I don't need to. I only maximum need to do it twice, Craig, by the way.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's that sense of, just taking up with the environment and living in it and allowing them as the people who own the performance, the sport is theirs, to really have the first-hand experience. And I kind of write and talk a lot about perspective matters, and that theirs is the one that leads the dance. And therefore, as coaches, we need to understand our own agency or lack of, and submit some of that to that interaction and try and dwell in their perspective as much as possible. So people have often called me lazy for sitting on the riverbank. There is a methodology behind it, somewhat lazy, but, trying to get low, trying to see things as it is, as they are for the athletes, just to get a sense of the invitations for action that they're seeing, which are very different to, I can be anything above to sort of 10 meters above them sometimes, and I get a very different view of the sport itself.
Yeah, no, I think that's, I like that. And I think, I think there's kind of this, we as a coach, we want to look like things like in a probabilistic way. Like as a coach, we'll often say, well, that worked that time, but it's not going to work. If you kept doing that, it's not good. Well, it only had to work that time, right? It was a solution for that particular problem, but we kind of we need one that's going to be generalizable across, I think that lens kind of clouds us sometimes, in looking at, individual movement success, right? Yeah. So, yeah. The kind of the last part I wanted to get to was, I think this is a thing that a lot of coaches struggle with. I can set up a drill, a constraints activity. I think you talk about changing the height of the poles on the slalom course, and I can not let people explore that. It's the guidance part. What do I do with what I see? Do I just stand back and just let them do anything? No, I still, coach still has a role. Was that hard for you to kind of, when do I step in? When do I, completely stop this activity because it's not working? Or, do you have thoughts on that? Yeah.
No, it's a great one and very pertinent. So I had a coach who I did a bit of mentoring with for a while, just come and intervene when I was coaching. Approached me when I was coaching the other day, and he was like, ask you a question. You seem to have time. And I was coaching, but I was standing back from the riverbank and not interacting much with the athlete. And I think on the surface of it, it could look that I'm being negligent. But very passive, not communicative, particularly other than eye contact, maybe, for quite long periods of an hour's training session.
Mm-hmm.
And thankfully, this coach we had the relationship with came over and said, "Are you finding yourself suppressing interventions here?" Getting old, because the athlete was really taking up with stuff. In the classic term, they were making mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
I would say they were learning.
Mm-hmm.
They were exploring the environment, and I guess what I plan to write about this at some point is that the timeline of coaching is not just the session
Mm-hmm.
that you're in. And we have shared a kind of pedagogical approach, how we see the sport. We've co-developed that, co-adapted to each other around it. And my role in the session is really kind of like, to facilitate, to guide attention sometimes, but not specifying what to do
Mm-hmm.
and how to do it, certainly. And to allow them to create the environment as well. And I think I generally see how their curiosity is taken up, Rob. So I know them well.
Mm-hmm.
And you can tell by the body language and the eye contact, are they still on a thread of exploration here?
Mm-hmm.
They're still seeing possibilities for action, and they're curious about. And that'll depend on the session type as well, right? So we, as you know from previous work that we've published, we periodize our approach to skill
Mm-hmm.
as well as physiological classic periodization. Well, for me, it's embedded within skill. So we do it from a skill-based and leading out from that. But so it depends on the session, because that dictates what my role is, and the athlete
Mm-hmm.
will communicate that over significant time. Like, Craig, your role today is this.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that we can't flex around that, but it might be very different in a performance training block to a skill adaptability block, for example,
Mm-hmm.
where we're not as accountable to performance,
Mm-hmm.
if we can say that phrase. And we are looking to explore the invitations in the environment. We might be adding more complexity than is representative. My interactions there might be very different, but what I'll generally do is engage if there's any emotion starts to, I guess, cloud
Mm-hmm.
the attention
Mm-hmm.
on specifying information. So then we might just have a little conversation. We might reflect back on what our intentionality was in the session. Is that still appropriate here?
Mm-hmm.
Are we still curious towards things? Where are we going? And that's from the coaching perspective as well as the athlete. That's prepared but not planned.
Mm-hmm.
So I might have to kind of try and anticipate where the flow of the session could go, because I'm coaching with probably anything up to 6 to 8 other coaches, sharing the water with another 22 paddlers, and it's very expensive as soon as we press go,
Mm-hmm.
press stop on the electric on the pumps these days. I have to have an anticipation that has come from a conversation or a taking up with each other over time as to what we're working on, where it might take us, but I have to be responsive in the session as well. And that might include just pressing pause, moving on to a different thing,
Mm-hmm.
Providing constraints to shift into a more maybe stable space of water if they're really struggling and the
Mm-hmm.
emotions and the anxiety is getting too high. Or it might be that I have to, just get out of the way as they're just on fire and just coming up. I mean, my daughter is the best games designer or environment designer I've ever known, Rob. So I've learned to get out of the way more and allow the athletes. They have some brilliant, if they're given permission, and I don't mean that from a power perspective from the coach, but if we don't, I guess, eliminate permission by the way we coach in the environment, then you get access to some fabulous session design from athletes themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a great. I found that the same. I don't, I don't coach as much as you, but I find the same kind of body language, the engagement. Sometimes I see an athlete really struggling, with the activity which created, but you can see like the smoke coming out of their ear, like they're really determined to figure this out, right? And you're like, okay, I'm not. You're kind of hitting the right. I think that the challenge level, I think, is, that's what I try to. Obviously we designed this activity together. We believe in it, so I don't want to abandon it immediately, but I think tweaking the difficulty a little bit, within the parameters of the activity. I like to get kind of that right. Pushing them, but not giving up. Totally, yeah.
Working through that together is fun. I mean, I think I used to go, well, you can get off if you want.
Mm-hmm.
And of course,
Yeah.
Athletes don't want to get off.
No.
So you're like, the luck you get then. And that used to work in my eyes at the time, but it wasn't a good way of coaching. It was kind of like black and white, very conflicts between coach and athlete. I think now it's like, as we said at the start, you have to meet people where they're at. And that's, in our world, that's, presentation of constraints over different timelines. And that changes in the session, between sessions, over blocks, with, mood, anxiety, emotion being some of the shorter timescales for constraints that change. So you have to meet people where they're at and scale from there. But it's much better scaling than it is, I think, taking over and removing agency and things like this, and directing.
Getting too prescriptive and I think it's a real art. And it's like something you really have to work at. And again, that kind of thing, I think that confidence issue I'm supposed to be coaching. I got to get in there. Yeah.
I like asking the question many feels, but when it's getting tough, I'm like, and I might ask it of the athlete, or I might be asking it of myself, like, what's important now? And the acronym is WIN in capitals, obviously, which is handy for sport. But it's like, what's important now, and that will take into account the intentionality within the session, prior to the session, how they're presenting within the session, and where we are within a block, and how our communication's going as well.
Yeah, I think that that's the relationship you have with the person. We, like you said, I think you said you started with that kind of naturally. I think some people that comes to naturally based on their personality and their kind of social experiences and things. But it's so important. For sure. But so I guess to end, Craig, I don't know, this kind of open. Do you have some advice that you give to people that kind of want to start coaching in this way, that are kind of more where a lot of people were thinking about prescription, telling the athlete what to do, looking for mistakes, like you said, and is there a way? Like, I know it's not a simple answer, but is there a way that you kind of lead people into it?
I'm conscious of not pontificating from my own experience, because it's contextual. I think some things that might be useful to encourage in a safe set, like you said, we all operate under constraints, and we're using constraints, Therefore, I think having an awareness of the theory behind the constraints-led approach is very, very useful. It's very, very useful for me. That was probably, beyond the questioning side, that was probably where I next went, and very critical. And then, you learn how that's situated within the nonlinear pedagogy approach. And you start to understand that, things like self-organization and the value of those sort of approaches. Because I think you can do CLA with awareness without theory. You could probably do it. But with theory, you really anchor your own references around what is skill development, what is the environment interaction, and also what is the role of the coach. And my other encouragement, Rob, would be alongside asking what the sport is, would be where possible, try and have almost a co-coach alongside. A safe space. I'm fortunate enough to mentor others, and I know that they see me often, and I'm outside of their sporting world quite commonly, as a safe space around something they're stretching towards, something they're trying out. That they don't have to answer to metrics or hierarchies within their own organization. I'm just a sounding board of a safe space of things they're trying, much like athletes. Coaches need permission to try stuff, and to stretch stuff, and to experiment and explore. And we shouldn't be this static entity that is complete, and that knowledge is, we are not. It's more of that embracing amateurism than considering ourselves as experts.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great piece of advice, and I remember there's a study a few years ago about, they kind of surveyed what sources of knowledge coaches go to, and like journal articles was, but talking to other
coaches, not good for us, is it?
No, talking to other coaches, I think, was the single highest. I think you're right. I think that safe space of not having to be the authority, and always know the answers, and did this work? What about,
I think when we consider why that is, to round off, Rob, I've been fortunate enough to be on some excellent and a lot of coach development, coach education opportunities in the UK. And pretty much everyone I hear will tell you that the network that comes out of those experiences is more critical than the content delivered. And I kind of think, well, why is that? What's going on there? Because there's some real, informed people, experienced people, like giving the opportunity with this knowledge. And I think it's just because you're always becoming with others. It's ongoing. The knowledge isn't to you, and then it's there and it's done. Okay, you might take up with it and mold it. But it's a relational thing, isn't it? Like with others, you're continuing to explore, to become, and to move forward with others. So I think, the more you can have a strong network around you, if you have that opportunity, and there's not many people say no if you reach out to them, I've found.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, yes. And you mentioned that's what, when you interact with someone that's not kind of aligned with this approach, one of the things I always try to do, okay, what can I learn from them? They obviously know a lot about, so I started asking them lots of questions, about why you do this and what, so yeah, I think that's a great advice, having a network. And I think, we've tried to do this with, some of the great, those conferences and the constraints that, just hearing examples and people thinking through how they're doing it. I think, you can't, that's really helpful for a lot of people. So, well, thanks, Craig. I really appreciate it. I encourage everyone to read this your paper. I think it's a great mix of, you get Coach and with Carl and Keith getting the academic side, but it really, I think,
absolute pleasure to write with that.
I think your kind of observations in it, your reflections that you call them, I think add a little bit to it beyond the kind of the traditional theory paper on its own, right? I think it connects with kind of more practical and personal experiences with it. So yeah, I really encourage everyone to have a read. So thanks, Greg. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.